absolute delight to be here this morning. And it's a particular delight because while our two organizations represent the medical professionals from different ends of the same spectrum, I think, as has been hinted at, it's sometimes better to think about this spectrum rather than as a line, as more like a globe. And there are connections, particular connections, I think, between both those towards right the way through to the end of careers and those at the very beginning that we represent. So this morning, I'm just going to talk to you very briefly about some of the stuff NZMSA has been up to this year. Our motto, which is useful at times like this, is that we are to unite, empower, and represent medical students. So we'll use that as a sort of rough framework to work through very lightly what we've done and how that's involved ASMS. So firstly, in terms of uniting, the most literal meaning of that is to bring together our membership. And that's something we do through a number of events, such as conference and the Clinical Leadership Forum. ASMS have been integral to both those events, particularly over the last few years, providing both support and contribution that makes those events far better than they'd be without that input. But I think more importantly, we like to see those events as important for training the kind of things that you don't necessarily learn in medical school, those advocacy and leadership qualities in medical students, which will eventually, we hope, future through to be future leaders in organizations such as ASMS in a few decades' time. When we're not uniting our members, empowerment takes several different forms. One particular example is how we like to empower the voices of our membership so that they're heard. And a good example of that has been the Teaching Award we've recently launched with NZMA. This is a grand national award that goes to one SMO or GP and one RMO, and we think it's a powerful way of recognizing truly outstanding teaching. I think it's particularly important, especially now, when both our organizations have very rightly turned to some of the darker and more negative aspects of the culture that we need to address. It's worth remembering some of the best bits of medical culture. And I think lifelong learning and lifelong teaching are one of those excellent aspects, and we're very proud to support that. Also, we're going to be hearing more this morning about the mentoring program we're planning on putting together with ASMS as well. I think that will speak to this as well, but more on that later today. Finally, in terms of representation, now often our advocacy overlaps with that of ASMS, particularly around addressing things around the medical culture. But an example, perhaps the most important bit of advocacy we've been involved in this year has been changing the lifetime student loan limit. Now, this is a particularly capricious policy that negatively affects students from disadvantaged backgrounds from finishing their degrees. We're very pleased to see that the current government agreed to, in opposition, change this policy, and we're optimistic about that happening. But as you can hopefully see from that very light wander, and I'm conscious of a fairly serious time pressure, there's a lot to share between NZMSA and ASMS. It's a relationship that's been building, and I think will continue to build long into the future. I also, on a personal note, it's kind of appropriate for me to be here today. So this is the last thing I'll do as NZMSA president. It's actually the last thing I'll do as a medical student as I finish my degree. And it's nice to be here in ASMS to see the kind of things that happen outside the medical student sphere into the clinical environment. It's something I absolutely intend to stay involved in. Anyway, so delight to talk to you today. Enjoy the conference. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'll see some of you around.
Is Marika here? As Marika comes up, I just want to tell you all that at the end of this first session, on the way to tea, we're going to have our group photograph. So we do ask you, after the minister's address, when we go out to tea, please follow the cameraman out onto the landing as soon as you can so that we can get one single photograph of the entire gathering here today. Marika de Vecchis is the Federal Executive Officer of ASMOF, our sister organization across the channel there. And we're going to listen to a few words from her now. Thank you, Marika.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all again this year, this time without the tremors. I'd like to deliver to you all greetings from the officers and membership and staff of the Australian Salaried Medical Officers Federation. ASMOF is the national trade union for all classifications of salaried doctor in Australia. We cover everyone from interns right through the ranks of doctors in training to staff specialists and senior medical administrators. We also cover medical students via an associate membership. We currently have around 12,000 members in Australia, and we are the only union in Australia that is run by doctors, for doctors. I'm happy to say that our respective organisations, the ASMS and ASMOF, have a long and proud tradition of mutual recognition and support. I think both organisations take a keen interest in each other's achievements. And on that note, I congratulate the membership and officers of the ASMS on the recent successful conclusion of your MECA negotiations. I have to say a few words about the rather dire political situation we face in Australia at the moment. As unions, we operate clearly in a political environment, and as doctors working in the public health system, you're subject to the vagaries of political fashions that come and go in relation to health policy making. We now have a minority government in Australia, and Aussies wake up most mornings these days to find out about the latest cabinet leak, or whose citizenship is being questioned, who's been booted out of Parliament for that reason, and which MPs are gearing up to mount a leadership challenge against our PM. And unfortunately, many important policy issues are simply being allowed to drift in Australia. But one thing that, unfortunately, our government has managed to achieve this year is a relentless onslaught of anti-worker and anti-union legislation. This year we've faced, as unions, an increasingly hostile environment in Australia. There's been a raft of anti-worker and anti-union legislation. Currently there are 5 bills in the Parliament which will further, if passed, which will further regulate union finances and spending and interfere in the democratic control of unions by their members. Recently we witnessed the unedifying spectacle of the Turnbull government using police to go after their political enemies. Many would say that that's reminiscent of a tin pot dictatorship in a raid on the offices of one of Australia's largest unions. Why is the anti-union agenda so important to our government in Australia? Is it just ideology? Is it about wounding the Labor leader Bill Shorten, who is a former union official, in the eyes of voters? Australian unions nowadays represent just 13% of workers. It's a touch more in the public sector, but surely it can't be about curbing union power in Australia. But they say out of adversity comes opportunity, and I think Australian unions have risen to the challenge posed by the current negative political environment. Many unions led by our national centre, the ACTU, have become lean, mean campaigning machines. This year has seen almost continual lobbying of the Senate crossbenchers against some of the very bad legislation I referred to earlier. ASMOF has even gotten in on the Act, visiting MPs in their electorate offices to urge them to vote down some of the worst of the legislation. So what is really needed, I think, is continual campaigning at the grassroots level. Unions must ensure that they're in touch with their members and that they're representing their hopes and aspirations. One very fine example of this close to home for us at ASMOF has been the campaign against the privatisation of certain rural and regional hospitals in New South Wales. Those of you who were here last year might recall that I reported on the community campaign against the New South Wales government's decision to redevelop 5 hospitals via outsourcing to the private sector. I'm happy to report that the government has reversed its decision regarding 4 out of those 5 hospitals. This is thanks to the consistent campaigning of all health unions in New South Wales, together with the community at the site of each proposed privatisation. But the fight is not over, there's one to go, and the focus now is also on campaigning to make sure that each of the hospitals that will remain in public hands are appropriately funded into the future. So I conclude my remarks by saying that I look forward to some stimulating sessions and discussion at the conference, and wish you all a successful conference. Thank you.